Let's talk a little bit about managing cursors or managing our data in general. Now, in the previous app, we used a simple, trivial example of accessing data when what we did was we opened the database, we grabbed or selected the data, and then we immediately closed the database. But what about more complex data retrieval? For example, data that takes longer to be retrieved, or just more complex, there's more data to retrieve. So how do we handle that in an Android environment? Let's discuss that. So the problem might be that we're accessing a database and the user suddenly reorientates their device. Say they've moved from portrait to landscape, for example, or they might press home and access another app. If we don't code in the fact or make allowance for that to happen, we can potentially have corrupted data, and that's because the life cycle of the app doesn't have any idea about the database being accessed. So we really need to link those two things together, the database and the life cycle. Now we can do that. We can effectively open our database once, and then we can query or requery data as needed, and only close the database when the activity is destroyed, when it's closed. And in the case of a restart, if the user changes their orientation from portrait to landscape, we can also code for that as well. So it's really making the activity that we're on the screen be aware of the database. Now, there are lots of ways to do this. One way is to use an old deprecated method called start managing cursor, and you'd pass the parameter there of the cursor that you've set up to access your data. And the idea there is you're actually telling the activity, please manage this cursor for me, so it would automatically close it and so on if needed be, if it needed to. But that's not recommended because it has been deprecated, which basically means that Google are telling us not to use this anymore. We could do it manually. So in other words, we could add our code to each life cycle event. Now, just to refresh your memory, we did talk about life cycles of an activity, of an app, I should say, and the activity, the current screen in the Flickr app. So if you're unfamiliar with what life cycle means, certainly refer to that app. So essentially, we can do it manually. We can add code to each life cycle event to do the appropriate thing. For example, when the activity is closed, we could close the database. Now, that will certainly work, and there's been lots of apps that are created like that. Probably the biggest disadvantage is it's a lot more code. You need to code each of your screens, each of your activities to for your database. That means, like, for example, if you want to add a field to the database, you might have to go through and change it in a lot of areas. So it's really perhaps not the most ideal way to be doing things. We could use an async task. Now, if you recall from previous apps, an async task is used to access data asynchronously. In other words, it'll access the data while your app is doing other things. Now, that will also work. We could fire off an async task if we wanted to retrieve some data. And so your app would work normally. And then what would happen was when the data was fetched and returned, we could then update that on the screen. That will work. But the biggest advantage is similar to the previous one in that there's a lot of code. You need to add async tasks to all your activities, which will end up being a lot of code. Best way forward, in my opinion, is to use a content provider. Now, a content provider is a standard way to provide access to a structured set of data. It doesn't necessarily have to be a SQLite database, but it certainly will work. And in fact, SQLite is a good example here. Now, a content provider is a core feature of Android development. So in a nutshell, we set up a content provider in our app, and then we provide a mechanism to return those results to the calling process. Now, that calling process could be our app, but it also can be another app if we choose to share the data. Now, you don't technically need a content provider if you don't intend to share data. That's really one of the major purposes of a content provider is that mechanism to allow access to data that's elsewhere. But in my opinion, I feel it's a better way for you to do this with all your apps. And it's just so your app is set up in the right way in the event that you do want to share data down the track. Other thing to keep in mind is Android provide us with a good list of built-in content providers for things like audio, video, and images, 3 examples, and we are going to work more on those in the future. The point I'm making here is that content provider, then that mechanism is used extensively within Android, and I think it's a good fit here in database coding to be using content providers where possible. And again, my recommendation is to use a content provider for all your database projects because it really adds more flexibility. And the other great thing is when it really comes down to it, once you've created your first content provider class, which we're going to be doing, it's not really much more or any more complex than any other method. I mean, it's something you need to learn, but once you learn it, you can sort of copy and paste a lot of the code in future projects. But that's one side of the coin. So the content provider is used to manage the data and provide the data back to the calling process. Now the calling process could be an activity that we've created, but how do we access the content provider? Well, we access the content provider and its data by using what's called a cursor loader. Now a cursor loader, it runs an asynchronous query in the background against the content provider and it returns the results to an activity or a fragment activity. And now this means that the app continues to work while the database is being accessed. And again, asynchronous means that it's accessing data while your app is working. So your access isn't sort of paused or waiting for a response from the data. So from our point of view, that's perfect because it means that our app can continue working and drawing something on the screen or doing whatever it's doing while it's waiting for the database to return the data. So all we need to do to implement a cursor loader, and apologies for the spelling there, I've just noticed I've got 2 R's on the end, it's only meant to have 1 there. But look, we just implement callbacks in our regular activity code to call the content provider. So we need to do things like initialize it and to get it to provide the data back to us, from the SQLite database. For example, to initialize it, to make the connection from your app to the content provider, and also to get the data from the content provider, so that they get the results of a query and return to your app and so on. So what's next? Well, I think it's time to put together another app. Now the app is going to define a content provider, and again, the content provider's purpose is to manage the data and to provide a mechanism to return that data back to your app. So the content provider is going to provide the data, we're going to create that component, and then we're going to create a cursor loader, create cursor loader code in order to access that content provider and to get the data back from it. So the content provider does all the work in the database, manipulating the data, and the cursor loader is our way to access the content provider, doing things like sending information to it so we can update a record, for example. Okay, so let's get into that in the next set of videos. We're going to go through and create an app to do just that using our existing contacts database that we've defined in previous videos.